Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to Clearer Than Truth. Today we're joined by Bojan Pancevski, the chief European political correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. We'll be discussing his gripping new book, The Nord Stream Conspiracy, which offers the definitive behind-the-scenes account of the most audacious acts of sabotage in modern history. Bojan, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. You just wrote The Nord Stream Conspiracy. So you described this as an audacious operation carried out by sort of an amateur team on a shoestring budget. What surprised you most about the operational tradecraft once you reconstructed the story in full?
Well, what surprised me the most was how it was basically carried out by people without any prior experience in doing such things, because the crucial part of the work was done by civilians, by deep sea divers who had no training in the clandestine sort of arts of secret services or the armed forces. And essentially it worked out because they put their lives on the line. They were willing to take enormous risks despite the odds, and in a setting where they did not have the resources, the technology, or they just had the wherewithal, basically, And it kind of reminded me of these audacious operations that we learned about in history, from the Second World War, because nowadays Western countries have a lot of resources, a lot of technology, but also a lot of regulation, a lot of health and safety kind of mentality. And so things have changed in the Western world. It's to do something like this would require, it would not be authorized, I don't think, by any sort of self-respecting agency or armed forces in Europe or the United States. So, it was interesting that how when with their backs against the wall, people just are willing to do, extraordinary things in what they believed was, an operation serving the national interest of their country.
Bojan, my next question is, you paint a very vivid picture of the divers who carried out Operation Diameter. And specifically, there's a diver who she kind of, not to reduce her, but she's a bit of sort of just a diving bum in her 20s and 30s. And then she gets sucked into one mission and then she's like, I don't know. And then she shows up and she carries it out. But they're largely diving enthusiasts. What was the selection process for this mission, and what does their lack of hesitation reveal about the collective psychology of this group who carried out the mission?
Well, in a nutshell, the mission was conceived and executed by an elite unit of the Ukrainian armed forces. The officers behind the plot, the kind of the masterminds of the operation, if you will, were veterans of the clandestine services of Ukraine, with over a quarter of a century experience in secret service work. And they had been fighting Russia essentially since 2014, ever since Vladimir Putin first attacked Ukraine, annexing the Crimean Peninsula and occupying parts of eastern Ukraine. So once they agreed on what to do and how to do it, they tried to find deep sea divers in the special forces community. And that proved to be a challenge because, as I learned in my research, special forces such as the Navy SEALs or the Special Boat Service in Great Britain or others, they don't typically operate at the bottom of the ocean, right? I mean, what they need to do is perhaps mine a ship or a bridge or another bit of infrastructure or cross a body of water unseen, undetected. But they don't typically go down that deep. And we're talking about, 80 to 100 meters below the surface of the ocean. So quickly they realized they have to find someone else. And they decided to hire essentially civilians, diving enthusiasts, diving instructors, rather. One of the members of the Special Forces unit was a hobby diver, deep sea diver, and he was plugged into that community in Ukraine. So through him, they approached a number of people and they put them through a very rigorous process of recruitment. I mean, in the first phase, they were kind of establishing their credential professionally and also whether they were able to operate under pressure, whether they were able to keep a secret, people were filtered out who were immediately sort of telling friends and family that they were being approached for some sort of secret mission. And then they had to establish that one kind of absolutely important criterion was patriotism. They were wary of people leaking details about this or being, less than entirely committed to the cause. And because there was no money involved, at least not at the beginning, people were not offered cash. They were basically told you have to risk your life for your country. And only a certain type of people will agree to do something like that. So in a nutshell, that was the recruitment process. Once they passed, they had a very short period of time to practice. They did this in a kind of in a former mine, abandoned mine that was filled with water. It's 110 meters deep, I think, a granite mine. And so they practiced for a short while, and then off they went on the mission.
I'm fascinated by kind of how it was approved, right? And I think it would strike a lot of readers as quite interesting that, it seems that President Zelensky was not part of the decision making on it, or could you explain that a bit for us?
Yeah, Zelensky wasn't part of the decision making in the beginning. So essentially, what happened was in the Special Forces unit, the senior officers drafted a list of projects, and then they went to their commanding general, who then went to the general that commanded the armed forces at the time. His name is Valery Zaluzhny. He was the kind of like the head of the Joint Chief of Staffs in the United States, I guess. And he personally approved it. And he even asked them whether Zelensky's cabinet was aware of it. And when the answer came back negative, he said, well, then don't tell them, because he didn't trust them. There was kind of tension between the military leadership and the political leadership. The reasons for that are manifold, but essentially, prior to the start of a full-scale invasion, the United States and Great Britain openly warned Ukraine, and even in public, that there will be a full-scale invasion. And President Zelensky was reluctant to believe the warning. He didn't take them for granted. The military leadership was more likely to believe them, or in fact, they did believe them. And so there was this tension about whether they were supposed to prepare for the war. In the end, they didn't really prepare for the war the way it came. So in the first phase of the project, Zelensky definitely did not know about it. Now, later what happens is that the senior military officers say that Zelensky was actually briefed and told that this operation was underway along with other operations. Zelensky denies this. His people around him deny this. They've denied this in public. They deny this off the record. So, that's the state of affairs.
Do you buy that?
Well, it's hard to say. I think we'll only find out the full truth if General Zaluzhny, the former head of the armed forces, decides to speak out about it, because obviously only he can tell what happened between the two men. I don't think Zelensky will ever change his statement, right? Because he said it publicly several times now. He's not going to kind of roll back what he said. So interestingly, Zaluzhny wants to run for president once there are elections. That's in the weeds. Who knows? But it might come to that elections will be announced next year, perhaps even. So if that happens, he might run for president. If he does run for president, I think the issue of Nord Stream will be publicly relitigated, and then we'll see whether or not he's willing to discuss it. What's important to say is that I wrote once an article for the journal about how the German investigators, identified the suspects for whom they issued arrest warrants. It was kind of an exclusive report, and then a Ukrainian outlet translated it into Ukrainian and put it on their Facebook page. And General Zaluzhny, who's now ambassador to the United Kingdom, to Great Britain, used his official account on Facebook to comment below that article of mine translated. And he said, I'm quoting from memory now, but he said, fun times are ahead of us, but we will never be ashamed. And it was a kind of a cryptic remark, and people started reading into it, whatever they wanted. But essentially, a lot of people thought this is sort of tantamount to kind of an admission, right? What does it mean? We'll never. Why would he say something like that under an article about the German investigation identifying, Ukrainian officers as suspects for the attack on Nord Stream. So that I found that very interesting. So we'll see. I mean, he's very much a soldier. He's not a politician. He's a kind of a straight up kind of guy, straight talking. So if he does start acting as a politician and giving interviews and we'll see what happens. But I think that will be the way to establish what actually happened in the end.
Interesting.
In great detail. So, I mean, I can't imagine the presidential administration wasn't made aware of it, because as you will read in my book, the CIA was made aware of it. So when the CIA became aware of the plot to destroy the pipelines, they kind of jumped. The news within the CIA spread all the way to the top echelons, to William Burns, who was the head of the agency, the director of the agency at the time. And I think he personally gave the order to warn the Germans and to tell the Ukrainians to stop. So the Ukrainians were informed by the Americans that they should cease and desist. The presidential administration or members of it say they never actually got the warning. They don't know how the warning came. Was it at a technical level? What was the phone call? Did they miss the phone call? So, I mean, who knows? I don't want to push boundaries beyond what I've written in the book, but, we'll see one day perhaps.
Well, one thing that does seem clear from my reading of the book, which again was a phenomenally fun read, is the Ukrainian government very much left the people who carried the operation out to dry. There never seemed to be a plan for what would happen after. It seemed inevitable that these people would always be tried, which is happening now, and that they would go to jail, which is happening now. Why couldn't the Ukrainian government provide some sort of cover for these guys a little bit better, more deniability, or some sort of a plan to get them out so they couldn't be tried for carrying out an act of war during a war?
Well, first, just for the context, there are 7 arrest warrants issued. The German prosecutors say that these are the 7 people who were on the boat: 4 divers, civilians, and 3 military officers, member of a special unit of the armed forces. One of these officers is dead. I think the German investigators are aware of that. He died on the front line fighting for his country. He volunteered for a frontline unit, which was fighting at the so-called zero line. That's the kind of the death zone, and he died on Christmas Day, in fact, 2 years ago. But still, there's an open arrest warrant for him, because I think he counts as missing in action. A lot of people in Ukraine are missing in action because their bodies hadn't been retrieved. So that's the context. Why they didn't prepare for that? Well, first of all, this was one operation of very many operations, clandestine operations that were kind of happening at the time under the auspices of the armed forces. They were all done on the fly. I mean, literally, a lot of the war that Ukraine is, a lot of the war fighting that Ukraine does so successfully is done on the fly. Some operations are very meticulously planned, and they get a lot of resources, and the president personally is involved from the onset. I mean, one such operation was the Operation Spiderweb. If you remember, I think it was last summer when they blew up parts of the strategic fleet of the Russian Federation with tiny little drones. Another operation was actual invasion of Russian territory in the area known as Kursk. These are things where the president is personally involved. There are many, many other smaller things where the president is not aware, and sometimes it's just the unit, the kind of executing unit doing it. The armed forces are quite fragmented in many ways, and they also, a bunch of them are privately funded, because Ukraine is a poor nation, and there's a lot of politics involved in how the armed forces are run. So people sort of go to the business community, they go to crowdfunding, they go to oligarchs for funding, and therefore sometimes they kind of act semi-autonomously, So, in a word, they didn't really prepare for this. They moved on. It was one operation, they moved on to another and then another. And they also couldn't kind of conceive that the Germans would be so good at investigating that they will actually sort of come breathing down their necks eventually. So we'll see what happens. One person has been arrested. The German prosecutors say this person was the commander of the sailboat which was used for the operation. the sailboat that carried the officers and the deep sea divers. And so he will be put on trial in the city of Hamburg in Germany sometime in the fall, probably in September, could be later. And he's been charged with war crimes, interestingly, among other things, but this is the more serious charges. He was indicted recently, and I think the prosecutors opted for that indictment because, in a way, they are circumventing the Ukrainian defense, because the Ukrainian defense was, well, this was war. You can't, when combatants are acting on behalf of their country in war, they cannot be put on trial in a civilian court, because there's something known as functional immunity, combatant immunity, right? Because they're soldiers. Now the prosecutor is saying, fine, that's war, but it wasn't legal, it wasn't legitimate, because the target you hit is our pipeline. So you can't just go around hitting our pipelines away from the front line, away from Russia, and therefore this is a war crime. It's a very serious charge, and I think a lot of people will be upset in Ukraine when this hits the news, when the trial starts. And it will be also very interesting because this war is riddled with war crimes, and especially war crimes committed by Russia. And I think they're quite obvious. You can switch on the telly and see, the missiles hitting kindergartens and things. And now the first officer who will actually be put on trial in a Western court will be a Ukrainian officer for blowing up the pipeline, and he will be charged with war crimes. So that it will be an interesting dynamic, I think. But
I just
go ahead.
I want to sort of ask the opposite of what Nathan just asked, which is, I mean, how is it politically tenable for Germany to actually bring this charge? In the sense that, I mean, this is a country that actually perpetrated true war crimes, indisputable war crimes on Ukrainian territory decades ago. Let's set that aside, however. They basically establish a pipeline which makes Russia, puffed up and rich enough to engage in this despicable war. And now they have the temerity to bring combatants to trial for war crimes for undermining the infrastructure that essentially enabled Russia to engage in revanchism. I mean, the levels of irony to me are just extraordinary. But having spent time in Germany as a fellow at the German Marshall Fund, where I interviewed members of their former diplomatic staff who referred to what they called a Russia first foreign policy under Merkel, I mean, it doesn't surprise me, but I'm just wondering, how is this politically tenable? I mean, like, do Europeans sit there thinking like, oh, yes, Germany suffered millions of euros of damage because of the pipeline, so someone has to be held on the hook. Let's go after, the people that are fighting for their lives to not live under under Putin. I'm flabbergasted by it.
Well, I think the Ukrainians will agree with everything you've just said, and a lot of people in Germany would probably agree as well. In fact, I know they would. There was a debate in the German parliament recently, I think last month. We're recording this in July, so this was in June. And the main opposition party, which is called Alternative for Germany, AfD, quoted from my book in their push to set up a parliamentary inquiry into the Nord Stream case. They misquoted, actually. They used actual quotes, but in the wrong context. The government refused their initiative and said there is a judiciary inquiry. There's no need for a parliamentary inquiry. Once the trial is over, we can think about it. But now, why would we interfere with the law? And then the government quoted from my book as well, but they quoted rightly to make sort of the argument that you're making now. So it was quite a fiery debate, and some people just stood up and said, I remember one of the Green legislators said, Nord Stream was the worst thing we've done in foreign policy since the Second World War, or since the Cold War. It was kind of it's a hugely momentous bad decision. So you're not alone in your analysis. But then, of course, there's the other side where people will say, well, look, there are two Nord Streams, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 1 was the older pipeline. Nord Stream 2 was the newer pipeline. Nord Stream 2 was under sanctions. It was always very controversial, and it was built entirely after Putin attacked Ukraine in 2014 for the first time. So that's another part of Angela Merkel's legacy. In retrospect, it does appear bizarre to many geopolitical thinkers in retrospect that you would want to build an extra pipeline connecting you to a country that just had invaded and dismembered another country. But that happened with Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 1 was less controversial, and it was a pan-European project. Germany was involved. Russia obviously was the majority stakeholder, but the Netherlands, a French state company was involved, Engie. So Nord Stream 1 was less controversial, and I think a lot of people will say, well, Nord Stream 1 was fine. We shouldn't have built Nord Stream 2. That was an overkill. But destroying Nord Stream 1 is just too much because it's kind of a crucial artery for bringing gas to Germany. And you have to remember, again, I have to mention Angela Merkel. She accelerated the shutdown of nuclear power generation and essentially swapped nuclear for gas, right? Because in Germany, you need gas to heat up homes. You need gas to power the industry. You need gas to generate electricity. So once you've shut down nuclear, you have to get electric power for somewhere. And the only other options are that Germany has kind of en masse is coal and gas, right? There's nothing really else. Of course, there are renewables, but renewables are not reliable. They don't have that baseline energy that's always the same. They have baseload energy that can only be provided by nuclear, gas, or coal. So they opted for gas. So then they became addicted to Russian gas, right? Because Russia was the cheapest supplier. It offered the best deal on the market to Germany, not to every other country, but to Germany. And a large part of that deal was Nord Stream. So, a lot of people in Germany will say, well, it was great for us, and now they blew it up. Fact of the matter is, Putin shut down the gas even before the explosions, actually kind of a couple of weeks before the explosions, because he wanted to put pressure on the Germans to stop supporting Ukraine. So, to answer your question directly, the German prosecutors will say, we're not interested in the politics. We don't care how this looks like. We are only interested in the letter of the law. And that's something you have, having been in Germany as a scholar, I guess you've noticed that the Germans are interested in the spirit of the law, but they're also very interested in the letter of the law. And this perhaps a little bit different than the Anglo-Saxon culture. In Britain, you don't even have a written constitution, right? So it's a more kind of a nimble understanding of the law. In France, to an extent as well. In Germany, the letter of the law is supreme. So the German prosecutors say, right, the pipeline landed in Germany, ergo, we are under attack, ergo, we have to prosecute. Then they catch this guy, and then they say, oh, you say you're a combatant, but you didn't wear a uniform. If you didn't wear a uniform, you were not recognizable as a combatant. Therefore, we cannot admit that argument in court. This is what they will say, that the lack of uniforms in itself is sufficient to make these people non-combatants, or rather illegal combatants, right? So this is the kind of legalistic thinking that permeates the case. And I do think, in fact, that they were not thinking about the politics, because one thing is for sure, the actual police who investigated, who did the operational work of the prosecutor is the boss of the police, but the police investigators, the detectives, they certainly didn't care about the politics. They were just ambitious to solve the case and to find the perpetrators, whoever they are. Even before they started looking towards Ukraine, they were looking in the direction of the United States. Then they were looking into whether Russia did it. And then finally, they found some sort of leads pointing towards Ukraine. And they were not interested in the politics of it. So when I told them, well, this will look ugly, they were like, that's not my job. I'm not supposed to think about this. Now, what you're saying should be the concern, obviously, of the Chancellor and the Justice Minister. So the Chancellor of Germany has a constitutional right to interrupt the investigation. He could order the Minister of Justice to stop it. Then the Minister of Justice would order the prosecutor would order the police, and that would be the end of it. But they're not, to my knowledge, they've never really considered this, and I don't think they will do it because it will be politically untenable. The media will be up in arms, and I think the opposition will be obviously all over them for it. So I think it's just going to go on, like by inertia, it kind of happens, right? With the core political consideration that you just outlined, never actually featured in the thinking of the prosecutors and the police. And by the time it reaches by the time the politicians actually found out what the police knows and where the police is going with the case, they were rather uncomfortable. I mean, I described this in the book, that the previous government and this government were not at all comfortable with the findings of their own investigators, right? Because the last thing they need is a headline in a news story saying, Ukrainians blew up the pipeline, when they have to transfer 11.5 billion euros to Ukraine this year. But it seems like it will just happen.
Right. And but I ask, I mean, in a couple points, I mean, in a civil law system, the discretion of the prosecutor is in some ways more important than in a civil law system, or excuse me, in a common law system like we have in the United States. I mean, the number of crimes that you could prosecute in a civil law code is so extraordinary, and there are a limited number of resources that the public have. And I think, vindictively pursuing punishment for the perpetrators of a so-called crime is different than, releasing, publicly the information surrounding what occurred, right? I mean, the idea that you have to have a trial because, it becomes clear that Ukraine did this, I think doesn't really follow for me, specifically in the context of Germany having such a high tolerance for extraordinary white collar crime in its own system. I mean, it was the FBI of the United States that had to clean up FIFA. It had enormous corruption going on.
No, not just FIFA. It was the regulator in California, if I'm not mistaken, that first foiled the diesel conspiracy of the German car makers. Right? They were cheating on the on the kind of pollution
Wirecard.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry, and how many Germans are hiding assets in Russia, and the state knows this, and the state does nothing. So, I mean, if it were purely, a cultural difference, I maybe I could grant them some leeway here, but it just doesn't seem to work out. I mean, clearly there is a political calculus on the part of this local prosecutor who wants to bring the case.
So it's the federal prosecutor. This guy is the highest prosecutor in the country, is the federal prosecutor general. So they deal only with the kind of top crimes, terrorism, anti-constitutional sort of crime and stuff like that. So they picked up the case from the beginning.
Okay, I mean, I remember when Germany was essentially threatening, Donald Rumsfeld with, a war crime prosecution, asserting universal jurisdiction. I mean, I think we're all familiar with, some of the legal theories that come out of Germany, but I mean, more importantly, I just want to highlight that I think, it's not just a failure of, Germany to take into account what Nord Stream was going to do to the, European dynamic with Russia, essentially addicting them to Russian oil and also allowing Putin to engage in this revanchism. But it also was the United States. I mean, I was sitting on the Hill in the Senate chamber when Anthony Blinken, as a nominee, essentially stated that the United States accepted Nord Stream as a fait accompli. And I think perhaps that culpability is why people like Foreign Minister Sikorsky initially assumed that it was the United States. He famously tweeted out, "Thank you, CIA," right? So to the extent that the United States has any kind of sway in trying to persuade the German state to avoid what I think is a highly wrong-headed prosecution, there is a responsibility. But those are just my kind of peripheral points that, I mean, I think that they might find a different path as this trial goes on, because it shocks the conscience, I think.
I hear you. Well, I mean, I go into it in my book a little bit, the American side of things. The Biden administration basically lifted the Trump sanctions on Nord Stream 2 as a gesture not only to Germany, but to Russia, because they, like most contemporary American administrations, had a plan for a Russia reset. And they wanted to show a gesture of goodwill to Putin which was entirely misunderstood on the Russian side. It was A, taken for weakness, B, it was taken for a carte blanche in Eastern Europe, and C, the Russian mind interpreted that essentially the Americans are only interested in China. They're not interested in Eastern Europe. They're kind of pulling out of Europe in general. So now's the time to go into Ukraine and finish the job. There's a rather unfortunate set of events where, in global diplomacy, people talk past each other and, they misunderstand each other. And, things like that happened in the First World War, Second World War as well. And, quite often. So it's rather unfortunate what happened there. But it did happen. And I think it was, in retrospect, it was misguided on everyone's behalf, the kind of diplomacy around Nord Stream. Because, a lot of people will say, a lot of credible people, not just the Ukrainians who have a skin in the game, but also, Rasmussen, Andreas Fogh Rasmussen, the former NATO chief, he was twice, I think, NATO chief, he told me Nord Stream was always a geopolitical weapon. It was never a commercial project. And he said, I told Merkel this. I told Angela, this is a geopolitical weapon he's building against you. Don't engage in it. And she said, oh, no, it's fine. It's just it's cheap gas. It's great for us for our economic growth. And of course, it did work like that. It was great for economic growth until the full-scale invasion. So, both sides turned out to be right in a bizarre way. People said, don't do it. And the people who were in favor of it enjoyed the benefits of it until it stopped giving them benefits and it turned into liability. And so Germany has since paid and overpaid. All the money they saved on the cheap Russian gas, they've wasted now on building LNG terminals and on kind of trying to emancipate themselves from the addiction to Russian energy.
Well, were the consequences worth the action? Did Ukraine get what they want? Did it help them in the war in the short term or in the long term?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of people will say, look, Putin shut down the pipelines shortly before they exploded. Nord Stream 2 was never put online because it was sanctioned after the war started. B, it was never certified by the Germans because the war was looming. And Nord Stream 1 was operating, but then Putin stopped it in a bid to kind of put the chancellor under pressure. However, it's perfectly clear that Putin wants to repair and restart the pipelines. Like days before the pipelines exploded, he put a proposal on the table to the chancellery, which was secret at the time. It was revealed since by my German colleagues. There's a great book called The Failure, which examines Germany's Russia policy over the past few decades. It's called The Failure by star journalists in Germany, Georg Maskolo and Katja Gloga. I very much recommend this book. And they basically reported exclusively, I believe, that Putin put this proposal, I think 6 days before the pipeline exploded. He said, look, I have a technical problem with Nord Stream 1. Why don't you just certify Nord Stream 2 and lift the sanctions so we can send you gas through Nord Stream 2? Because the Germans were willing to get gas via Nord Stream 1. They never wanted to stop, right? To this very day, there's no actual embargo on importing Russian gas and oil into Europe, right? I mean, there are certain types of measures, but Europe still buys, Russian energy. And in the first year of the war, it was buying like crazy, right? I mean, the billions of euros were flowing from Europe to the Kremlin, and the Kremlin was kind of transmutating this cash into death kind of on the Ukrainian battlefield. Whereas at the same time, the Europeans were transferring billions to the Ukrainians to kill Russians. So you had this weird situation where Europe was supporting both sides, unwillingly. Obviously, they didn't want to support the Russians, but they didn't have a choice because they had to. And so, these things are, I mean, these hydrocarbons, geography largely determines the trade, but also it's not easy to it's a zero-sum game. You can't just kind of decide, I don't want to buy from the Russians anymore, I'll just switch. It doesn't really happen that quickly, and we're witnessing that even now. I mean, I think the EU said that they will stop buying gas in 2027, but we'll see what happens. I think that's a long way from now, and who knows what will happen. We saw what happened with Iran when there's an energy shock, people quickly started talking about starting to buy from Russia again, because, you have to buy from somewhere. So, the saga is by no means over. I have pretty serious reporting that the Russians raised Nord Stream with the American negotiators over Ukraine when they started talking to the Trump administration last year about a settlement in Ukraine and about an overarching settlement beyond Ukraine. One of the first things they mentioned is fixing and reopening the pipelines Nord Stream. And the foreign minister of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, said that even publicly at some point. He gave a statement to Russian media. And recently, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were told the same thing. So this is an ongoing thing. The Russians invested a lot of money, a lot of energy, a lot of geopolitical kind of focus into this instrument that is the Nord Stream pipeline, and they're absolutely not willing to give it up, right? So they are persistent, and we'll see what happens. They have a long breath, and the government in Germany might change. As I said, the opposition party is very pro-Russian now. It's very strange for a nationalistic party to be pro another country, but they are very pro-Russia and pro-Putin, and they are now campaigning on reopening the pipelines and reopening the gas trade and the oil trade. So I don't believe they will come to power anytime soon, but they are the biggest party in the polls at the moment, or in some polls at least. So Putin has, he's an autocrat. He's not going anywhere. He's not going to be booted out by the voters. He's going to be there forever, as long as he can stay alive and able to kind of grab onto power. So as long as he's there, he will want the pipelines reopened. So we haven't seen the end of it. Whether or not it worked, the authors of the sabotage told me they think it was a good thing to do. They would do it again, and that they removed the possibility of Germany buying gas through this pipeline. They believe at some point they would come to an agreement and Putin would have restarted the exports, and now we would have had a situation where gas would have flown directly through the Nord Stream. And they say we've ended that potential, right? It's blown up, and now it's much more difficult to repair it and restart it than it would have been to just start the gas again. So from their perspective, it worked. Some other analysts will say, well, it was folly. They shouldn't have done it. They risked too much. Germany could have turned against them. They could have destroyed public opinion or turned public opinion against them. So, I'm not taking sides in this debate, but the fact of the matter is the pipelines are now broken and Putin is trying to fix them.
In closing, unless George has anything else, but I want to be respectful of your time, when it's all said and done, how will the attack, the trial, and the consequences weigh on the final outcome of this conflict? I know that could be a broad question, but in short, will this sort of change the rules of the game for future actions to end the war?
Well, the trial, will be an unprecedented event, I think, in legal history. There hasn't really been a trial like this before, and I think sort of legal stratagems and theories will be tested on both sides, the prosecution and the defense. I think political pressure will be heaped onto Berlin and Kiev in this trial, because the German government will be forced to explain their policy. And I think the Ukrainian president will come under pressure to explain what is actually happening in this trial, because he doesn't recognize any connection to this operation. But the man who will be put on trial was a captain of the army at the time. He was a veteran of the war against Russia. He fought in the Battle of Kiev from day one of the full-scale invasion. He's a veteran of the special service, the SPU, the biggest, is comparable to the CIA in Ukraine. So, he will no doubt be seen as a hero to the broader public in Ukraine. So it will be very difficult to say, well, we don't know what he was doing there. He committed some crime and he should answer for it. It will be very difficult because, alone the fact that he was serving on the front line at the time of the crime means that he would have had to have deserted in order to leave his post, leave the country, cross the border somehow, and then get to Germany and then blow up the pipelines on his own time and initiative, right? So it will be very difficult to make these arguments. And also other people, the other suspects who may be named in the trial were officers, right? And they were also serving in a combat unit. So it will be very difficult to say, well, all these people kind of deserted simultaneously. They obtained passports, real passports and fake names, and they spirited themselves away from the front into Germany, and they found themselves on a boat blowing up the pipeline. So I think there will be pressure on the government, on the political leadership, but also on the military leadership. I mean, as a side note, Zelensky purged the military leadership that was in office at the time of the attack. So now there are new people. None of the officers who were familiar or involved in the operation are now still in office. They were all gotten rid of, retired early, fired, etc. So, but I think some of them will feel honor bound to speak, right? Because I presume reporters will go to them. They're easily identifiable, and people will say, well, what was happening? How come these officers ended up there? Who sent them and why? So I think it will be interesting. And as to what changed, I think what changed is very profound. The authors of this attack never thought about it, but essentially now everyone knows how easy it is to blow up a piece of mega infrastructure that is kind of crucial to a huge economy like Germany or Western Europe. In fact, the effect was not only on Germany, but on surrounding countries as well. And Germany is, I think, the second or third biggest economy in the world, certainly the biggest economy in Europe. And it's actually, it's enough to get a small yacht and 6 to 7 people, put them on board and off they go, and they blow up this, almost 1,000 miles long infrastructure with the biggest ever offshore pipeline system in the world. So the whole operation cost around $250,000. The pipelines cost $20 billion to build. So I think the lesson from this is it's terrifyingly easy if you find people who are A, competent, and B, willing to put their life on the line. And I think it is not that hard to find. I mean, we saw what happened with 9/11, right? I mean, that was a similar kind of, much worse, of course, but similarly unexpected sort of attack. And I think now everyone knows kind of it's doable, right? So for a state actor, but also for a non-state actor, you only need a small crew of trained people who are able to sail a yacht and dive. And if they're willing to take the risk, then, you can do anything. And this infrastructure is everywhere, right? Undersea pipelines, oil pipelines, gas pipelines, internet cables, absolutely crucial for the functioning of modern economies and societies. Electric cables, there's so much damage that can be done in this fashion. And I think the attack kind of crossed the red line. No one before that was seriously aware that this could be done so easily. And therefore, there was so much misinformation or misunderstanding about what might have happened. In the beginning, you will remember people were saying, oh, you need a submarine, you need drones, you need 500 kilograms of TNT explosive, you need this and that. Well, no, actually, it was a tiny little yacht, tiny little pack of explosive, and a small crew of people who were drinking and smoking. And, half of them were not even trained for doing a job like that. And nonetheless, they did it. So I think that's the big and kind of terrifying thing at the same time.
It certainly is terrifying. Bojan, thank you for your time. Obviously, people can buy your book, Nordstrom Conspiracy, wherever books are sold, and it is really fantastic. But where can they also follow your other continued reporting? Are you on X, LinkedIn? Of course, yes, the journal.
Yeah, of course. I mean, on the Wall Street Journal website, I'm on X, I'm on LinkedIn, I post on Instagram sometimes. So yeah, if they feel like, they can follow me on all these kind of channels and read the Wall Street Journal.
Wonderful. Thank you for joining. Thank you for your reporting. And of all our guests, I will proudly say the best hair we've had so far. Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to join us next time and share with your friends.